Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We get a lot of requests to unpack complicated topics, and this was definitely up there.
Oh, yeah, this is a big one.
What does the Bible actually say about the role of women in ministry?
Huge question. And honestly, you find so many different perspectives within Christianity, it can get pretty confusing.
Totally. So for this deep dive, we're going to really dig into what the sources you sent us have to say, look at different interpretations, those key Bible passages everyone brings up, the whole deal.
Yeah, you guys gave us a lot to work with this time.
For sure. We've got this super in-depth article from Biblical Culture, whole Reddit thread on Immer Bible where people are, going back and forth, and then clips from Mike Winger's YouTube series, which is always interesting. So formal analysis, casual debate, a little bit of everything. Should be a good one.
Yeah, it's a good mix to get a sense of how people are actually approaching this.
Right. So the Biblical Culture article starts off, and this is interesting, by saying that even defining ministry biblically is kind of tricky.
Yeah, not as straightforward as you might think.
Right. Like you assume everyone's on the same page, but they share this anecdote about a Baptist and a UCA lecturer. Both felt called to ministry, but one was thinking, okay, pastor, that kind of leadership. The other was like, any way I serve God, that's ministry.
Which makes total sense when you think about it.
Yeah, background, church tradition.
Yeah.
All that plays into how we define even basic terms.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just like personal opinions either. Even the Oxford Dictionary of English, when it talks about ministry in religion, it's got two definitions: the specific job of a minister, and then just any spiritual work, any service a Christian does, especially spreading the gospel, that's also ministry. So already we're seeing there's room for interpretation just based on what the word means.
Makes you realize how important those dictionary definitions can be, right?
Oh, for sure. And then if we look at how the word's used in the Bible itself, the Biblical Culture article points out in the Old Testament, like the ESV translation specifically, ministry doesn't pop up too often.
Huh.
Yeah, and when it does, it's almost always talking about the Levites, what they were supposed to do. So, Numbers 4.47, 2 Chronicles 7.6, stuff like that. It's all about their work in the tabernacle, the temple, that very specific service.
So pretty narrow definition back then.
Exactly. Very tied to a particular group and their duties. But then things get way more interesting in the New Testament.
I was going to say, got to change somehow, right?
Oh, yeah. The Greek word that usually gets translated as ministry is diakonia, and the basic meaning is just service. Now, the article points out when the ESV chose to actually use that word ministry for this Greek term, it's usually when someone's serving God directly, like doing something for him or on his behalf or serving other Christians.
So it expands beyond just the temple stuff.
Way beyond. You see it with what the apostles are doing in the book of Acts, how believers are supposed to serve each other in books like 2 Corinthians, even when it lists those roles, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers. In Ephesians, it uses ministry there too. It's not just one job title anymore.
Wow, that is a big shift from the Old Testament.
Huge. So we're not just talking about official positions anymore. It's this broader idea of serving within the Christian community, right? Which is why the Biblical Culture article, they go for a pretty inclusive definition for their whole discussion. Any service that Christians do for God, representing God, or helping other Christians, formal, informal, it's all under that umbrella. That's how they're going to be looking at this whole women in ministry thing.
Okay, so they set the stage with that wide definition. Then they get to what everyone wants to know. Can women be pastors or elders? And they don't really beat around the bush.
Nope, straight to the point. They say women, good to go in any ministry, as long as they're not teaching men or having authority over the whole church, which, according to them, means women can't be pastors or elders.
Which brings us to that Reddit thread, right? Cause that question, women as pastors, that's exactly what they were arguing about. And it sounds like some pretty interesting points got brought up.
Oh, yeah. One person went straight to Romans 16.7, where Paul sends greetings to Junia, calls her outstanding among the apostles. This user was like, boom, case closed, female apostle.
That verse comes up a lot in these conversations.
All the time. But as you can imagine, the responses on Reddit, not everyone agreed. Someone countered outstanding among doesn't automatically mean she was an apostle. They were like, why was Matthias chosen to replace Judas if there were other apostles around, in the book of Acts? Why wasn't someone else picked?
Yeah, it makes you think about all the different ways you can read those verses.
Totally. And that's what makes this stuff so complicated, right?
Yeah.
You've got the words, but how you interpret them, the historical context, translation choices, all that factors in.
It's not always cut and dry. And it seemed like that one Reddit user, they were pretty set on sticking with tradition. Like, We've understood it this way for so long.
Very much so. Like, one verse isn't going to overturn 2,000 years of tradition. That was their feeling.
Interesting. Someone else had a different take, though. They said maybe women could be pastors, but only over other women. Not a whole church, more of a teacher role.
Ah, okay, so kind of a leadership position, but gender-specific.
Right. But people push back on that, too, saying a pastor's got to teach, and this person believed that the apostles didn't want women teaching men in church.
Ah.
So back to those key passages about who can teach and have authority.
Full circle. And another user made a point that I think is worth highlighting. There are good arguments on both sides. It's not like one group has all the verses on their side and the other is just making stuff up.
That's so true. It's easy to fall into that us versus them mentality.
Right. It's more complicated than that. Which is a nice segue into Mike Winger's video. He starts off by defining the two main camps in this whole discussion. Egalitarian, meaning no gender restrictions on leadership, and complementarian, which at the very least means women shouldn't be elders or pastors.
And Winger seems like he wants to have a respectful conversation,
Yeah.
right? Not just shut down one side.
Totally. He's all about open, honest, and kind discussion. He even says there are sincere believers on both sides, which I think is important. Oh, and one more thing he brings up early on, which is relevant to those Old Testament examples we'll get to later, is that a lot of those are just examples of what happened, not direct commands from God.
Oh, so just because a woman did something in the Bible doesn't mean we have to do the same thing now.
That's his point. Context matters, culture matters. It's trickier than just saying, well, Deborah did it, so.
Makes sense. Okay, before we get to the Old Testament stuff, let's go back to the biblical culture article, what they say about women as deacons. They seem more open to that, right?
Yeah, they actually argue that women can be deacons. And they have a few reasons for this. First, they're going back to their understanding that deacons are servants, not teachers, or having authority over the whole church. So they point to 1 Timothy 2.1:1-12. And since there's nothing saying women can't serve in that way, they see it as allowed.
So if it's about serving and not teaching or leading, it's okay. What's their second point?
This one gets into the actual words used in the Bible, which is always fun. So in 1 Timothy 3.8-13, where it's talking about qualifications for deacons, verse 11 uses this Greek word, genikos. Now, that can be translated as wives or women. Big difference.
A huge difference. Changes the whole meaning.
Exactly. And the biblical culture article, they show the original Greek and how they translated it. Similarly, women must be dignified. Then they compare it to the ESV, which says, their wives likewise must be dignified. And they point out that word there, it's not even in the original Greek.
Oh, wow. So maybe it's not talking about the wives of deacons at all?
Could be. They're saying it's stronger evidence that Paul's talking about women who are deacons themselves, not just married to one.
Fascinating how one little word can change everything.
It's crazy. Right. And then their third point actually builds on that. They say, okay, that same word, gynikos, it's not in the verses before that where it's talking about qualifications for pastors and elders, 1 Timothy 3.1-7. So they're like, if Paul was going to talk about the wives of church leaders, why not mention them for elders too? It's an argument from silence, but it makes you wonder.
Yeah, why mention it in one place but not the other? Interesting. And their final point about women as deacons, that uses an actual example from the New Testament, right?
Yep. Romans 16.1. Paul calls Phoebe a diakonos of the church in Century. That word can mean just servant, but they're arguing, based on all their other points, that she was probably an official deacon.
Ah, okay, so taking that word in context.
Right. But even if you just go with servant, they say it still shows women were allowed to serve the church in important ways, and a deacon is a servant, so...
It fits. So biblical culture seems open to women deacons, but still holding that pastor and elder are for men only. What about other things women can do in the church, ministry-wise?
They give a whole list. Praying out loud, 1 Corinthians 11.5 talks about that. Prophesying, same verse. Also Ephesians 4.11. Evangelism, Ephesians 4.11 again. Teaching other women, that's in Titus 2.36. And using their spiritual gifts, whatever those might be, within the church. That's 1 Corinthians 12.4-11. So a decent amount of stuff they're allowed to do.
So not completely shut out, but definitely some boundaries.
Yep. Their basic summary is women are good for any ministry as long as it doesn't involve formally teaching men or having authority over them, specifically as pastors or elders.
Okay, got it. And they also kind of criticize how some modern churches are structured.
Oh, yeah, they're not fans of how some Western evangelical churches have moved away from that two-office model, just elders and deacons. They think all these new positions, it just makes things confusing, especially when it comes to what women are allowed to do.
Interesting. Now, switching gears a bit, One of Mike Winger's videos tackles those Old Testament examples that everyone loves to bring up, women in leadership back then.
Right, because people use those to argue both sides. Winger starts off by saying everyone agrees women couldn't be priests in the Old Testament, no argument there. But beyond that, there's a lot of debate. And he points to Deborah, who was both a judge and a prophetess, as a super important example, plus other female prophets like Miriam.
And he reminds us again about being careful with those examples, right?
Oh, yeah, big time. He's like, don't just assume you can copy and paste from the Old Testament to today's church. These are more about what happened then in that culture, not necessarily direct commands for us now. He's all about context, which is important to remember. He also quickly recaps what he said in earlier videos about Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1, men and women are both made in God's image. Both have authority to rule over creation. Genesis 2, that's where we see the husband's leadership role in relation to his wife, but that was even before the fall. So just laying that groundwork.
Good to have that background. Okay, let's get into the specifics. Miriam, what's the deal with her?
So Winger presents the egalitarian view, which some scholars like Blomberg and Strauss hold. They say Micah 6.4, where God says, I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. That means Miriam was supposed to be a leader, just like them, leading Israel.
But Winger doesn't necessarily agree with that.
He pushes back a little. He says, just because God sent her doesn't mean she had the same leadership role as Moses and Aaron. Plus, what Miriam actually did during the Exodus, it's not always clear in the text. Then he brings up Exodus 15, where Miriam's leading the women in singing and dancing after they cross the Red Sea. And even that, there's debate about whether she's leading all of Israel or just the women.
So much to unpack and even a short story.
I know, right? It's all about interpretation. Winger mentions the complementarian view. Guys like Piper and Grudem, they tend to say Miriam's ministry was just focused on women. But then egalitarians like Mark Moutzko, they point out that when it says Miriam sang to them, it uses the masculine pronouns, so maybe it was a wider audience. So even something that seems straightforward, there's room for different readings.
Definitely keeps things interesting. What about Huldah, the prophetess in 2 Kings 22? She gets brought up a lot, too.
Oh, yeah. So King Josiah finds a book of the law, right? And he sends people to Huldah to ask God what it means, what they should do. Egalitarians, scholars like Philip Payne, Craig Keener, they focus on the fact that Josiah chose Huldah over other male prophets who were around, like Jeremiah. To them, that means she was a big deal, a respected spiritual leader.
Seems like a good point.
Right. But Winger throws out a different possibility. He says maybe they didn't specifically pick Huldah. Maybe she was just the prophet who was in Jerusalem at the time, the one who was available. He acknowledges that Huldah gave a powerful word from God that had a huge impact, but he also points out prophecy is kind of passive in a way. You're relaying God's message, but not necessarily making decisions or leading in the same way a king or judge would.
That's an interesting distinction.
Yeah. He also mentions Isaiah's wife. She's called a prophetess too in Isaiah 8.3. And his overall point about female prophets is God clearly uses them both in the Old and New Testaments. And it's not just because there were no good men around.
Makes sense. Oh, Deborah, she's like the star of the show when it comes to these Old Testament examples. What does Winger say about her?
He knows she's the big one, and he acknowledges there's tons of debate around her. She was a judge and a prophetess, which was unique. He points out all the other judges in the book of Judges are men, so maybe there was a general preference for men in that role, even if it wasn't forbidden for women. He lives out Deborah's main jobs, rescuing Israel, which involved military strategy, and representing God's judgment in legal matters, similar to what Samuel did. Some complementarians, they try to minimize her role, saying she just did private counseling and prophecy. But then there's that crucial interaction with Barak in Judges 4, where Deborah tells him to gather his troops and go to war.
That's where the big disagreement comes in, right? Was she commanding him or just passing on God's command?
Exactly. Winger points to Deborah's words in Judges 4.14. She says, "Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand." It's her own language, not just, "Thus says the Lord." Then Barak hesitates, and Deborah prophesies that the glory for defeating Sisera will go to a woman, Jael. Winger says this isn't necessarily against women leaders, it's more about Barak's lack of faith.
Interesting take. So where does Winger land on Deborah overall?
He says she was definitely a leader, judge, prophetess, but not a priest or queen. And in some ways, she was less hands-on than other judges. She didn't personally lead the army. He also points out the Bible seems to be concerned that there aren't enough strong male leaders in Israel at that time. He thinks both sides, egalitarians and complementarians, sometimes overplay or downplay certain parts of Deborah's story to fit their argument. And then he asked a really good question. Does Deborah being a judge mean women can have political authority today? He doesn't give a hard yes or no, but he says it might not have been the norm, but God didn't seem to rule it out either.
Wow, so much to think about with just Deborah alone.
Right. And then he briefly touches on those royal women in the Old Testament.
With Jezebel and Esther.
Yeah, he says egalitarians don't usually use Jezebel as an example because, well, she was evil. But he did find a few people arguing that she actually had more authority than Ahab. And Esther, her authority came from the king. And it was all about that specific crisis with the Jewish people. He also pushes back on some examples that scholar Linda Belleville uses about women advising kings. He says the wise woman of Tekoa who went to David, she was sent by Joab with specific lines to say, not really an advisor. And the wise woman in 2 Samuel 20 who negotiated peace, yeah, she was smart and influential, but it was a crisis situation, not an official role.
So specific situations, not necessarily the norm.
Right. And then there's that confusing verse in Isaiah 3.1, women rule over them.
Yeah, what's up with that?
Winger says the Hebrew word for women there is really close to the words for creditors or lenders, so there's a textual issue. He says it could be metaphorical, talking about weak leaders, or maybe it was a situation where women who weren't usually trained for leadership in that culture were suddenly in charge. But overall, he's like, this verse is too unclear to base a whole theology on.
Good point. Don't build your whole argument on shaky ground.
Exactly. And lastly, he talks about the priesthood in ancient Israel, which was men only.
Right. Women couldn't be priests.
Complementarians often say this shows that the highest spiritual authority was always meant for men, and they see that carrying over to the New Testament with elders. Egalitarians have a couple of explanations. A popular one is that all those rules about being ceremonially unclean, periods, childbirth, that would have kept women from serving as priests. But Winger argues the Bible never explicitly says that's the reason, and women still participated in other temple stuff despite those things. Plus, male priests could also be ritually unclean, but they just had to do certain rituals and then they were good to go.
So, not a clear-cut answer.
Right. Another egalitarian explanation from scholar Philip Payne is that maybe it was because priestesses in other religions, pagan cults, were associated with prostitution, and Deuteronomy 23.17 mentions that. But Winger says, this is just speculation. Deuteronomy isn't talking about Israelite priestesses. Winger's conclusion is, the male authority thing seems to make more sense. It's consistent from Genesis 2 to the New Testament that men have the highest authority roles. Doesn't mean women can't lead in other ways, but the top spots, those were for men. And he points out priests were the ones teaching the law, being mediators between God and the people.
So even with something as specific as the priesthood, lots of different ways to understand it.
Totally. Now, we got to talk about one New Testament passage that always comes up. There's Corinthians 14.34-35.
The one where Paul says women should be silent in church.
That's the one. He says women can't speak in church, they gotta be submissive, and if they have questions, they should ask their husbands at home. Even that Reddit thread mentioned it. It's a key verse, for sure, and Mike Winger actually says he's going to dedicate a whole other video to it later in his series.
Okay, so we'll have to wait for his take on that one. But before we wrap up, I wanted to mention Winger's first video in this series, Why We Can't Think Biblically About It. It's about how we approach this whole topic.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. He talks about all the reasons why people sometimes avoid actually dealing with the Bible passages directly, like letting your personal experiences shape how you interpret things, or seeing it all through the lens of feminism, for or against, or saying gender roles in church are just about patriarchy or tradition.
He also talks about those philosophical arguments that kind of sidestep the Bible itself.
Right, like some people say, since men and women are equal in God's eyes, any difference in their roles is automatically wrong. He critiques that view, specifically how Rebecca Merrill Gruthis presents it. He also mentions other common assumptions, like that complementarianism always leads to abuse, or that submission is always bad. And that thing where people pick one or two favorite verses, like 1 Timothy 2 or Galatians 3, and ignore everything else. His main point is, we got to go to the Bible directly, be as unbiased as we can, and actually wrestle with the text.
Which is hard, but super important.
For sure. It's a reminder that our own baggage, our culture, all that stuff, it affects how we read these ancient texts.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
Uh-huh.
What are the big takeaways, the things people should really remember?
Well, first off, it's clear that this whole question of women in ministry, it's complicated. The sources you sent show how much disagreement there is on how to interpret even key Bible verses, which leads to a whole range of views, from very restrictive to more open. And there's that tension between those Old Testament women who were leaders and some of those New Testament passages that seem to limit women's roles. It's a long-running debate, and it's still relevant today.
And that thing about context, that's got to stay top of mind.
Absolutely. You can't just read the Bible like it was written yesterday. You got to understand the history, the culture, all that. And just as important, be humble. Try to understand other viewpoints, even if you disagree. Don't just write people off.
So much good stuff to think about.
It's a lot, right? This has been a fascinating deep dive, even though it's super detailed. It just shows how much there is to consider when we're trying to figure out what the Bible says about women in ministry.
No easy answers, that's for sure.
Nope. But it leaves you with some questions to think about. Out of all the stuff we talked about, what really sticks with you? What makes the most sense? And what new questions do you have about leadership and service in the church? This is an ongoing conversation, so keep thinking, keep studying, and figure out what you believe.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.